For those interested in going from dipping their toes, so this is very basic. This is not, you know, if you get into this one, then maybe you want to do something more advanced or whatever. But as I said, then you kind of want to choose what you're interested in. So why am I giving this little course? Because I've done some classes on various parts of the Bible, so people think I actually know what's in there. So people, Mac and others, have asked me about reading the Bible and declaring they have never read it. It wasn't too long ago that I was in exactly that same situation. So I may have some insights because, you know, I was facing that issue. So I did the summer service in August 2003, and I had to admit that well, I've read lots of things. I hadn't read the Bible. So I told people that in the next year I would. And you know, I'm a man of my word. So I did. And so I read the Old and the New Testament. Only later did I read the Apocrypha. We'll talk about the Apocrypha later on. So, why do you want to read the Bible? Well, it's a difficult book, there's no question. And it has contradictions, but it's still the best way to find out what we believe is God's will for us. And personally, reading and thinking about what the Bible is saying has been a key tool in leading me back into true belonging to the Christian community after a long period of agnosticism in my middle years. So it's been very important to me. And once you get into it, you will find insights and joys and just plain fun. There are some wonderful reads in the Bible. That's not the only things that are in the Bible, but there are some. And on a petty but pleasurable basis, it's so lovely once you've read it to be talking to the fundamentalists and just stuffing them. So I know that's not particularly Christian, but hey, I am what I am.
It's a Bible.
So what are we going to cover? First of all, what's the Bible? Secondly, how do we choose the Bible? Thirdly, what are Bible reading strategies? And then a quick moment about talking about what comes next. So, the Bible is not a book. And Biblos, it's a library. And like any books in any library, the books don't always agree amongst themselves. And generally, each of the books of the Bible are separate. Books that need to be approached separately in your understanding and how you get into them. There are some exceptions. Some of the Old Testament books are divided for convenience, like 1 and 2 Samuel is really one book. 1 and 2 Kings is one book. 1 and 2 Chronicles is basically one book. And probably Ezra and Nehemiah were originally written as one book. And in the New Testament, Luke and Acts share common authorship, so you can, you know, it makes sense sometimes to go right from Luke into Acts if you're trying to get a handle on it. And so there's generally 3 parts to what might be called the Bible, but only 2 of them are in ordinary Protestant Bibles, such as the Pew Bible, though this is a Protestant Bible that does have the 3rd part, the Apocrypha. So the Old Testament, the New Testament, and the Apocrypha. Thank God for spell check, because every time I run a right Apocrypha, I get it wrong. But luckily, spell check keeps correcting me. So, the Old Testament is largely written in Old Hebrew. Although parts of Daniel, Ezra, and Jeremiah are written in Aramaic. And with all the possible ambiguities that arise out of Old Hebrew, because in Hebrew, there were no vowels, there was no punctuation. You kind of had to know the word you were looking at. Now, they didn't use as many vowels. And the books of the New Testament were written in Koine Greek. I'm going to talk about. And the books of the Apocrypha were written in a combination of Hebrew, Aramaic, and Koine Greek. I don't even know if I'm pronouncing Koine right. All I've done is seen it written. So.
Sounds impressive.
So a couple of imperial languages we want to talk about. Aramaic. Aramaic was the language of the Aramaeans. I bet if I'd asked you, you probably would have got it right just as a guess. A Semitic-speaking people of the region around between the northern Levant and the northern Euphrates Valley. Now, if you do get into it and you're reading Kings, you will read quite a bit about the kingdom of Aram, which is basically the same place as Damascus. It was adopted as an imperial language, even though it wasn't theirs. It was a conquered people's language by the Neo-Assyrian Empire, which was from the 900s to 600s BC, and the succeeding Babylonian and Persian empires continued the practice. And it became very widely spoken throughout the Middle East. It was the primary and perhaps only language spoken by the human Jesus. Occasionally, in the Gospels, we will hear Jesus speak in Aramaic. Like on the cross, when Dada or whatever. There's 2 or 3 times where Jesus speaks in Aramaic, in the midst of the Greek, so it's a direct quote. Now, I say perhaps because who knows? He was in an environment where there was a lot of Hebrew, there was a lot of Greek, But, so Koine Greek. Greek was the language of Alexander the Great. You guys all know who Alexander the Great was? And when he conquered basically all of the Mediterranean world west of Italy, east of it. And then when his empire broke up, there were successor Hellenistic kingdoms, including the Ptolemies in Egypt and the Seleucids in Syria and right down to Afghanistan and the borders with India. And then after they were conquered by the Romans, it continued to be the imperial language of the Eastern Roman Empire. And because of its widespread use among speakers of other languages, like any language that's used by a lot of people, some of the edges got worn off. So a more simplified version known as Koine Greek developed. And it became the common language of the Jewish diaspora. I mean, it's clear that's what Paul's primary language was, and so on. And that's why the New Testament is written in that, because basically people outside of Israel itself, that would have been the language that they had an interest in. I must somehow be doing this. Okay. So what happened with the Old Testament? The text, once they're out there. The Septuagint was the very influential Greek translation of the Hebrew Scriptures in the 2nd century BC in Egypt under Ptolemy II. And the Hebrew Masoretic text, developed in the 7th to 10th century AD by Jewish scholars, is the basis of most of our current Bible translations. Whenever you look at a Bible, you will see a preface saying where they got various things. And if you really, are sleepless and you want to read that, you will find they say that, yeah, we use the Masoretic text except for when we thought that something else was better. And they added vowels, or at least markers for them, pronunciation marks, and stress accents. But of course, that was a judgment they were making. Now, you may have heard this story before, but I love it, so I keep telling it. There's a story about the Septuagint. King Ptolemy once gathered 72 elders. 72 keeps showing up in the Bible. And I think that's what they think was in Genesis, that there were 72 countries. There's a lot of numerology that goes on in the Bible. He gathered 72 elders. He placed them each in their own room. And then he said, write to me the Torah of Moshe, which is, of course, the first 5 books of the Bible. And God put it in the heart of each one to translate identically as all the others did. So the story here is that 72 guys went in and they did everything exactly the same. Septuagint is very important for a number of reasons. I'll come back to it a little bit, but quotes of the Old Testament and the New Testament, because there's quite a few, are generally from the Septuagint. So the New Testament quotes often don't match your Old Testament text. For instance, if you see a quote from Isaiah in the New Testament, you want to go back, and they give you a little handy footnote, and you want to go, the words won't be quite the same. Because the Old Testament is being translated from the Masoretic text. The New Testament is being translated from the Koine Greek, and it came from the Septuagint. And there's a few times when that matters. Most importantly, in the Virgin Birth. And it's suggested the use of the Septuagint version by the Christians is what caused the Hebrew scholars to reject it. So the Old Testament is equivalent to the Hebrew Scriptures, although it's arranged significantly differently. And while parts have been put in writing probably as early as the United Monarchy of David and Solomon, key work on it seemed to be done, all you can tell is from internal. There's not any external proof. Around the Babylonian captivity, which is the time after the fall of Jerusalem, the Babylonians and the rebuilding of the Second Temple with, guys like Nehemiah and stuff. There are books added as late as the 2nd century BC, such as Daniel, but they always purport to be written earlier. And it was not put into a final list of what would be in and be out until late in the 1st century AD or even later, which was the time the New Testament was being written. I mean, there's no real... I just thought it was interesting. So, it's difficult to exactly date all the events of the book of the Old Testament. So I've got a chart, which probably won't help much, but I'll try. It covers from the creation of the world to and here David, who's about 1050 BC. The Assyrian destruction of Israel, 722 BC. The Babylonian destruction of Jerusalem, 587 BC, and the end of Nehemiah, which is about 400 BC. So here's this chart. So you can see, the main books are kind of in the order that they appear in the Bible. But Job, they tend to date in Genesis. Genesis, Exodus, Numbers, Leviticus, and Deuteronomy are all covering the same period. Joshua, Ruth is kind of in the period of Judges. And we'll be talking about these books. And the 2 books of Chronicles, basically, they start with David, and they carry through Kings, in fact, a little bit of the exile. And then down below you've got Saul, David, Solomon. David's accredited with a lot of the Psalms, so that's why they put it there. Solomon's credited with a lot of the other stuff. Who knows? And then after Solomon, Israel is divided into 2 kingdoms, the northern kingdom, which is Israel, and the southern kingdom, which is Judah. There's all the prophets. Some are north, some are south. Some are the foreign nations, some are in the period of the captivity, and then some are like Haggai, Zechariah, and Malachi, and then, of course, Esther, are after the refounding of the kingdom after the end of the exile. So, what kind of books are in the Old Testament? If you're going to read it, you've got to figure out what you're going to read. So Judaism and traditional Christianity have their own methods of describing it, such as the law, the prophets, the writing, the histories, wisdom literature, etc. You'll be surprised to know I have my own view about how to describe them, which I believe is a little more helpful. So in the Old Testament, there's books of law and legend mixed together. There's books of legend going towards history. As we get closer, there's more history and less legend. There's post-exile history. There's legends of the exile. There's an apocalypse. There's religious poetry. There's other poetry. There's wisdom literature. There's a book that addresses the problem of causation. There's fiction with a point. And then there's the prophets. So which ones do we put in each category? Law and legend, that's basically the first 6 books. Genesis through Judges. The legend and history is the 2 books of Samuel, the 2 books of Kings, the 2 books of Chronicles and Ruth. Post-exile history is Ezra and Nehemiah. The legends of the exile are Esther. Sorry, I have a daughter-in-law named Esther, so I always... and the first 6 chapters of Daniel. And the Apocalypse is the second part of Daniel. We had a reading from that part on Sunday, if you recall. And there's religious poetry, of course, the Psalms. There's other poetry, the Song of Solomon. Well, who knows what the Song of Solomon is? I'll talk about it a little bit more. Wisdom literature, which is the Proverbs and Ecclesiastes. The Problem of Causation, which is Job. Fiction with a Point, which is Jonah. And then the prophets. I think there's about 16 of them there, kind of thing. Something like that. And again, we'll talk about. And the New Testament is written from about the middle of the 1st century. The first things in the New Testament appear to be letters of Paul, through to the beginning of the 2nd century. Anything from 180 to 125 AD seems to be the kind of the cutoff point. There were many books written that didn't make it in, although most were written a little later. The first exact listing of the New Testament wasn't done until the Easter letter, and an Easter letter was, you know how difficult it is to plan around when Easter is going to be? Well, they had this, the Bishop of Alexandria wrote letters to Paul, this year Easter is going to be on such and such day. And he said, since everybody's reading his letter, he said, he made points. And in his letter 367, he said, these are the good things. And that's the first listing of the New Testament. So that's 330 years after Jesus' death. And the books are generally attributed, basically except for the letter to the Hebrews, but often by tradition rather than claim only, because often they don't say it's written by John or Mark or whatever. It's just attributed by tradition. Could well be right, but they don't claim it. And books clearly, in some cases, claim untrue authorship. There's no way, for instance, 2 Peter was written by Peter. I mean, he was long since dead when that one was written. So, what kind of books are in the New Testament? There's the history of Jesus and the early church. There's the Pauline letters. Now, that's not Perils of Pauline. Those are letters written by Paul. But, if you want, you read them, you sometimes do think it's the Perils of Pauline, right? There's other letters and sermons, and then there's an apocalypse. And again, we'll just kind of go through. So the history of Jesus and the early church, that's the 4 Gospels and the Acts of the Apostle. The Pauline letters, there's Romans, Corinthians, Galatians, Ephesians, Philippians, Colossians, Thessalonians, Timothy, Titus, and Philemon. I've tried to use colors. I had people criticize this thing, and they said, well, red sounds bad, and red is the best. But it just seems to be, it stands out a bit. So those 7 that are in red, almost all the scholars say Paul wrote those. And the blue ones, all the scholars, and there are exceptions in every case, say Paul didn't write those. And the black ones, people fight it. And the good thing is that most of what we really don't feel very comfortable in the Pauline letters is in the blue or a little bit in the black. The ones about women shutting up. That's in the blue. But it's still in the Bible. Other letters and sermons, there's Hebrews, James, 1st and 2nd Peter, 3 John and Jude, and then the Apocalypse is Revelation, which was our second quote this Sunday. We don't get a lot of apocalyptic quotes in United Church. This was kind of an unusual Sunday. But maybe it's just Harry. But it was probably in the lexicon. So the Apocrypha, and there's a test, so I'll get you to repronounce this word, deuterocanonical books.
Yeah, I use that word every day.
I thought Roger might, but I wasn't sure about the rest of you. Basically, Protestants call it the Apocrypha, Catholics call it the deuterocanonical. It's the same books, kind of. And so they're rarely found in a Protestant Bible unless you get like a special, but if they are, they're in the middle between the Old Testament and the New. But they're usually in those of other denominations such as Roman Catholic or Orthodox. And there's a bit of difference between the various denominations, which ones are in and which ones are out, and how they're arranged. Some of these books have been very important in these churches' doctrines and in much religious art. I think particularly the Book of Judith. And generally these can be found in Septuagint, that's the source of them. As such, they are additions to the Old Testament only. None of the Apocrypha apply, and there's some fascinating things like one of the prophets gets picked up by the hair to bring his soup to Daniel. Anyway, when he's in the lion's den. So, what's in the Apocrypha? You know, there's a pattern. Religious section, additions to Old Testament books, wisdom literature, prophetic, post-exilic history, religious poetry, and there's one philosophic treatise. So, which one's a which? Religious fiction, Tobit and Judith. Additions to Old Testaments, there's an addition to Esther, which is nice because it adds God to the story, not otherwise there. Additions to Daniel, there's 3 of them. I think that's where there's a prophet having to bring his lunch to Daniel's. Wisdom literature, the Wisdom of Solomon, and Ecclesiasticus, which is also known as Sirach, which is easier because otherwise it's hard to not get it confused with Ecclesiastes. And prophetic, Baruch with the letter of Jeremiah. Now, it's 2 Esdras, 4 Esdras, and that's just, some systems name some of the other books, like Ezra and Nehemiah as Esdras. So they already have 1 and 2 Esdras, so there's a different numbering, but it's the same book. Post-exilic history, the first 2 Maccabees, the 3rd Maccabee to a lesser extent, and the 1st and 3rd Esdras. There's a religious poem, the Prayer of Manasseh, and one more psalm, 151. And there's a philosophic treatise in Greek in 4 Maccabees. Now, if you're Dan Brown fans, you know that there are many other books that there was a great conspiracy to keep out because they're wonderful and so on. Or, anyway, there were other ones that weren't included that were considered or for canonical status or claims. They're written over a long period of time, even up to the Middle Ages, and they apply to both the Old and New Testament themes. Some were very popular and showed up in more definitive sources. The letter of Jude, which is in the New Testament, quotes from the book of Enoch, which is one of these. The Koran seems dependent in part on the infancy gospel of Thomas. There's a story in there where Jesus, as a child, takes mud and makes clay pigeons and brings them to life. And that story's in the Koran, so I don't know where else it would come from. I've read many of them, and as I've said up there, I'll use the technical term, they're generally weird. I mean, we're probably very happy they're not in. There's a couple that aren't, like, they said, no, these are too later, they're not, you know, there's a letter of Clement of Rome and so on, but generally, they're pretty weird. And confusingly, many of them are called apocryphal works. That's confusing. But there's no capital A. And, I mean, these are when you read about, you know, the Gospel of Thomas or any of those kind of, that's what's in this category. And we're not going to talk about them anymore, but I just wanted to acknowledge they existed. So, how do you choose a Bible? Since very few of us, except for Roger, can read ancient Hebrew, Aramaic, or Koine Greek, a translation is necessary. And this is challenging. Because by its very nature, the act of translation requires the translator make choices. It doesn't mean any ill purpose. One language is not the same as another language. And it started early. And then while the Hebrew scholars eventually rejected the Septuagint, as I mentioned, it remains the Greek Orthodox Old Testament to this day. And we use as sources early translations to other languages such as Syriac, which is closer to Aramaic. There's some Ethiopian ones. There's a bunch of other ones that we've used to try and put it all, making choices, because there are many, many versions of these books out there, and there's all little or large differences, and you want to figure out what's the oldest, and that's the trick that they're generally trying. So we don't live in the East, so we're kind of concerned about what's happening in the West. So for Western Christianity, the Latin translation of Jerome, known as the Vulgate in the 4th century AD, remained supreme until the 16th to 17th centuries, when various Protestants translated effectively into local languages. The Vulgate and its derivatives remain official in Roman Catholicism. So there were earlier attempts to translate the Bible in English, such as the work of Wycliffe. I don't know if you've heard of Wycliffe and the Wallards and so on, but the dominating figure in English translation was William Tyndale, a giant of the English language. I always thought that, if you ever wanted to get into the English language, you'd have 3 busts, all with the first name William. William Caxton, the first printer, William Tyndale, and William Shakespeare. Between them, they're kind of what determined modern English. He didn't translate all the Bible before he was executed. Henry VIII sent people over to the Low Countries, and I think he was burned, actually. Because, he's a good Orthodox Christian, that Henry VIII. The large parts that he did translate are estimated to make up 90% of those parts in the King James Version. Or let's say he did 70%, and of that 70%, now 90% is the work of Tyndale in the King James Version. So most of those great poetic sayings you remember, they go back to Mr. Tyndale. He had a gift. The King James Version was the dominant Protestant translation until the 20th century, and it's clearly influenced all subsequent translations of all denominations. Certainly what I grew up with, I imagine most of you did, and there's some pieces I can only read in here. I have dissonance between my brain and my mouth, as I found out when I did The Lord is My Shepherd once here. It's by far the most poetic version. And after all, if the King James Version was good enough for St. Paul, it should be good enough for us, right? That's what some of the fundamentalists seem to believe. So let's talk about today. I mean, you can still read King James Version. It's hard, but it's lovely. Yeah, it's necessary to look at the choices as well as the quality of execution of the choices. Sometimes the choices are extreme. There's the book known as The Life and Morals of Jesus of Nazareth, or the Jefferson Bible. This is where Thomas Jefferson got himself a King James Version and a pair of scissors. And he cut it up, and he didn't like miracles and stuff, so he threw all those things out and took the rest of what he liked and, cut and pasted them into a thing. That's the Jefferson Bible. Not my recommendation. There are sometimes, not often not, differences between Catholic and Protestant translations because of legitimate alternative readings of the same word. First, there's a word, presbytery, is it an elder or a priest? Those are legitimate readings of the word, and that's the problem with translations. Some translations give more emphasis to flow. I would say the 2 primary and good Protestant translations are the New Revised Standard Version, which is our Pew Bible, with a line of very clear dissent from the King James Version, which is, tries to be more word for word, and the New International Version, which is more sense-based. So basically, these two, I know that holding 2 books up gives you a lot of information, but anyway. Now, I said both are now as gender neutral as possible. Now, I did that and wrote that one before I was at our current services, because Harry's going to step further on some of that stuff. But Generally they've tried to go gender neutral. So if you get a 2011 NIV, that's the case. If you get one of the older versions before that, there's more he's and she's and so on. So I've got a few differences to show you between those two. I've also got a choice in Isaiah, which sticks in many particularly fundamentalist craws, and a passage from Samuel which says they just sometimes make different choices, use different sources. So this is 1 Samuel 6:19. In our Pew Bible it says, the descendants of Jeconiah did not rejoice with the people of Beth Shemesh when they greeted the ark of the Lord. And the Lord, that's he is the Lord, killed 70 men of them. The people mourned because the people had made a great slaughter among the people. But the NIV said, but the God struck down some of the inhabitants of Beth Shemesh, putting 70 of them to death because they looked into the ark of the Lord. The people mourned because of the heavy blow the Lord had dealt them. So in other words, two different reasons given. So, there's different texts out there that chose different ones to use. So here's some Isaiah. This shows a little bit of flavor, but it's very hard from snippets. But anyway. Then Isaiah, this is the Pew Bible, said, Hear then, O house of David, it is too little for you to weary mortals, that you weary my God also. Then the Lord himself will give you a sign. Look, the young woman is with child and shall bear a son, and shall name him Emmanuel. Then Isaiah said, Hear now, you house of David. It's not enough to try the patience of humans, or the patience of my God also. Therefore the Lord himself will give you a sign. The virgin will conceive and give him a birth to a son, and will call him Emmanuel. So that difference between a young woman and virgin, it's from it's actually a differentiation that happened in the Septuagint. The Hebrew, you can translate it either way. So Luke, and will not God grant justice to his chosen ones who cry to him day and night, will glory long in helping them? And will God not bring about justice for his chosen ones who cry out to him day and night? Will he keep putting them off? Not a big difference, but just kind of a tonal difference in the thing. So, either one of them, you're basically going to get the same story. There's more basic translations between translations and paraphrases. While there are a number of paraphrases out there, the king of today is probably the Message. In any paraphrase, you are relying heavily on the author's biases. Another good paraphrase closer to traditional language is the Living Bible. So I'm going to give you some examples from the Message and the NRSV and the Sermon on the Plain in Luke. So this is the Message, and this is the Living Bible. These are both from our library upstairs. So the Pew Bible version of these three verses. Then he looked up at his disciples and said, Blessed are you who are poor, for yours is the kingdom of God. Blessed are you who are hungry now, for you will be filled. Blessed are you who weep now, for you will laugh. Blessed are you when people hate you, and when they exclude you, revile you, and defame you on account of the Son of Man. Now those words probably sound familiar to you. Here's what Mr. Peterson in the Message, he just died. Then he spoke, You're blessed when you've lost it all. God's kingdom is there for the finding. You're blessed when you're ravenously hungry. Then you're ready for the messianic meal. You're blessed when the tears flow freely. Joy comes with the morning. Count yourself blessed every time someone cuts you down or throws you out. Every time someone smears or blackens your name to discredit me. What it means is the truth is too close for comfort, and that person is uncomfortable. And later on, I will show you what someone is like who comes to me. Here's my words and acts on them. That one is like a man building a house, who dug deeply and laid the foundation on rock. When a flood arose, the river burst against that house, but could not shake it because it had been well built. But the one who hears and does not act is like a man who built a house on the ground without a foundation. When the river burst against it, immediately it fell, and great was the ruin of that house. And here's what the These words I speak to you are not mere additions to your life, homeowner improvements to your standard of living. They are foundation words, words to build a life on. So you work the words into your life, you are like a smart carpenter who dug deep and laid the foundation of his house in bedrock. When the river burst its bank and crashed against the house, nothing could shake it. It was built to last. But if you just use my word in Bible studies and don't work them into your life, you're like a dumb carpenter who built a house but skipped the foundation. When the swollen river came crashing in, it collapsed like a house of cards. It was a total loss. Very different sounding. I mean, I think Peterson's done a good job on that stuff, and if you're more comfortable with, flowing it, sometimes it helps in interpreting. When you're stuck on one, you see, well, what did Mr. Peterson think it meant? So how do you choose? Well, like a car, you check them out and choose. And how do you check them out? It depends whether you're old style or new style. If old style, go to a library, including the one on the upper floor here, and take one on a test run. If new style, I recommend the Bible Gateway app. It's free. There's a lot of other ones out there, but I find that one pretty easy to operate, which has many versions. That's one of the problems. It has so many versions, but if you have a tablet, you can just start reading it. I mean, you can read it on the phone too. Depends on your eyes. And if you prefer to test or actually consume a Bible by the ears rather than the eyes, many of the versions of Bible Gateway have audio versions, and if yours isn't there, there are lots of other audio versions out there. I recommend to some just hooking your phone to your car, audio, and listening as you move about. So, how do we read it? So I'm going to read or listen to the Bible. Well, there's some true gems in the Bible, but it's sometimes a hard read. So you need a plan. There's the brute force approach, which is the one I took. You start at the beginning and you go to the end, You get a reading plan. There are thousands of choices. Just Google Bible reading plan and find one that fits. And apps like the Bible Gateway have plans built in, and they'll track them for you. So I did that, and here's 6 or 7 variations that just popped up. Chronological. Read the Bible in the order that the events happened, and that plan is 365 days if you follow it. There's the chronological New Testament if you only want to read the New Testament. 3 months, same thing. Classic. You read 3 passages each day, starting with Genesis, Psalms, and Luke. Takes a year again. Most of these ones are aimed at 1 year. New Testament. You read straight through the next for 90 days. There's one that suggests you read the whole thing in 90 days. Good luck on that one. There's one plan that has, you read a little bit from the Old Testament and the New Testament. There's Professor Horner's reading system. You read 10 chapters a day. That one's pretty tough. The Stay on Track plan. But the one, again, it's a year, but they load up Mondays to Fridays and have the weekend off. The Busy Life plan. That gives you 2 years to do it. And Thematic that lines it up and so on. So, I mean, there's nothing. I said, you can go on, you'll see lots more, and it fits your style. So, you looked at this thing, you said, it's a lot of pretty small print. I don't know if I can do that. Or maybe you say, I want to jump in, but okay. What if you want to choose a less ambitious plan? Well, if you do, I suggest the New Testament Plus. The New Testament is only about a quarter of the Bible. It's generally easier reading. And it's perhaps more relevant and definitely more uplifting, typically. There are a couple of exceptions. Now, in the New Testament, There are only two books that I think are both long and difficult. There's some that are long and there's some that are difficult, but it's only two that get both groups in front of you. And that's Paul's letter to the Romans and Revelation. Romans is the most theological and difficult, but it's well worth the effort. It has inspired such diverse personalities as St. Augustine and Luther to changes in life. Revelation can only be described as weird, but it is fascinating. And if you otherwise are, you can't finish the job. But luckily, it's the last one. So what to make plots? Well, I suggest you choose a few books of the Old Testament, and I'll give you a brief sketch of the nature of these books to help you choose. If you want to dip into the Apocrypha, I suggest pieces of religious fiction, Judith and Tobit. They're kind of fun reads. And if you're into history, perhaps 1 and 2 Maccabees. Now, 2 Maccabees has the first discussion of life and judgment after death, other than perhaps Daniel 12:2. Story of a mother and 7 sons that were all getting killed by bad Greeks, and said, but we'll get you. So one tool that came to my attention after I read the Bible, which I can recommend to make the job easier, people say, what am I reading? Is the Bible Project. Find it, go to YouTube and search the Bible Project, or you can go directly on the Bible Project site. They have short videos on most, if not all, of the books, which give a nice context. They have some nice overall videos on reading the Bible. And like all interpretations, you or I may disagree with theirs, but I've yet to find one that is ridiculous or offensive. So I've got an example of one, which you forgive me, I'm going to run and then make a couple comments about how it works.
The letter of James, or at least that's his name in English. If you look in the Greek, you will see that his name is Jacobos, which translates his Hebrew name Yaakov. And that's why most ancient and modern translations render his name as Jacob. And that's what we're going to call him in this video. Now, there are many Jacobs in the New Testament. 2 of them belong to Jesus' inner circle of the 12 disciples, but this letter comes from the Jacob who was the half-brother of Jesus himself. Now, we learn this Jacob story from the book of Acts and from Paul's letters. After Peter moved on from Jerusalem to go start new churches, Jesus' half-brother Jacob rose to prominence as a leader in the mother church in Jerusalem. It was made up mostly of Messianic or Christian Jews. This was the first Christian community ever, and we know that it fell on hard times during the 20 years that Jacob was its leader. There was a famine that led to great poverty in the region, and these Messianic Jews were being persecuted by Jewish leaders in Jerusalem. But through it all, Jacob was known as a pillar of the Jerusalem church. He was also known as a peacemaker who led with wisdom and courage until he was tragically murdered. And in this book, we have the legacy of Jacob's teaching and wisdom condensed into a short and very powerful work. The book begins like a letter. He greets all the Messianic Jews who were living outside the land of Israel. But this does not read like one of Paul's letters where he addresses specific problems in one local church. Rather, this book is a summary of Jacob's sage wisdom for any and every community of Jesus' followers. And Jacob's goal isn't to teach new theological information. Rather, he wants to get in your business and challenge how you live. Jacob's wisdom has been heavily influenced by 2 sources. The first is Jesus' teaching about life in the kingdom of God, especially the Sermon on the Mount, which he's constantly echoing and quoting in the book. The second key influence is the biblical wisdom book of Proverbs, especially the poems in Proverbs 1 through 9. Jacob literally grew up with Jesus and with the book of Proverbs, and so now his own teaching sounds like them. It's stamped by their language and imagery. The book consists of short, challenging wisdom speeches that are full of metaphors and easy to memorize one-liners. And in essence, Jacob is calling the Messianic community to become truly wise by living according to Jesus' summary of the Torah, to love God and to love your neighbor as yourself. The body of the book is in chapters 2 through 5, which consist of 12 short teachings that call God's people to wholehearted devotion to the way of Jesus. And altogether, they don't develop one main idea in a linear way. Each teaching kind of stands alone and concludes with a catchy one-liner. But all of these teachings are connected through key repeated words and themes. It's really cool. At the opening of the book's body, there are two teachings. First, about favoritism and love. Jacob exposes how we tend to show favor to people who can benefit us, and we neglect people who can't, usually because they're needy. Jacob says this is the opposite of love, as Jesus defined it. He goes on to show what genuine faith does and does not look like. So if someone says that they have faith in God, but neglects people who are needy or poor, this person's faith is dead, he says. Their actions betray what they say they believe, and genuine faith always results in obedience to Jesus' teachings. Now, scattered throughout the body of the book, we find three different places where Jacob develops Jesus' own teaching about our words. So, with the same mouth, we unleash pain upon people and then go offer praise to God. So messed up. And also, we judge people and then go talk badly about them behind their backs. And we also all tend to distort the truth to our own advantage. How we talk about people opens up a window into our hearts and our core values. Our words tell the real truth about our character. Jacob also believes that God's kingdom community, as Jesus taught about it, is the kind of place where the divisions created by wealth and social status are dismantled. So he warns first about the arrogance that wealth can create in people who believe it will be around forever. He says, no, your wealth will one day rot, just like you. In contrast, God's people are to live with patience and hope for Jesus' return to set all things right. And this should inspire a life of faith-filled prayer. Now, this part of the book, all of these teachings, they're so powerful, and there's way more than we have time for in this video. But seriously, read all of them and slowly. Now, placed in front of these 12 wise teachings is the introductory chapter. It's a flowing stream of wise teachings and one-liners, and they're designed to sum up the main ideas of the entire book. This chapter actually introduces you to all the key words and themes that you're going to meet in chapters 2 through 5. Jacob opens by saying that he knows from personal experience life is hard. He was martyred, after all, not long after writing this letter. But he believes that life's trials and hardships are actually paradoxical gifts that can produce endurance and shape our character. God can do amazing work inside of us in the midst of suffering and help us become perfect and complete. Now, that word perfect, it's really important for Jacob. He repeats it 7 times in the book. In biblical Hebrew and in Greek, this word refers to wholeness. It means living a completely integrated life where your actions are always consistent with the values and beliefs that you've received from Jesus. Jacob knows that most of us actually live as fractured people with big inconsistencies in our character. We are all more compromised than we want to admit. However, God is on a mission to restore fractured people to make them whole. And it begins with wisdom, the ability to see my hardships through a new perspective. God will generously give this kind of wisdom to people who ask for it in faith without doubting God's character. And when we realize our humble and frail place before God, we are forced to choose between anxiety or trust. And true wisdom means choosing to believe that God is good despite my circumstances. So if it's poverty that's forcing you into hard times in life, Jacob says, try and view it as a gift that forces you to trust in God alone. And besides, wealth is fleeting. It's all going to pass away like wildflowers in the summer heat. And so when we do fall into hard times, don't accuse God. Rather, let your circumstances teach you what Jesus taught about God's character, that the Father is generous, that he's there to meet us in our pain, and that he's trustworthy. It's this God who through Jesus has given us new birth to become new kinds of humans who can face their suffering with total trust in the Father, just like Jesus did. And this new humanity is something we discover when we not only listen to God's word, but do what it says. Jacob calls God's word here the perfect Torah of freedom. He's referring here to the greatest command of the Torah as passed on to us through Jesus, that he freed us to love God and love our neighbor. And Jacob shows practically what that kind of love looks like. It means speaking to others in a kind and loving way. It means serving the poor, and it means living with wholehearted devotion to God alone. Now you can see how this opening chapter contains all the key words and ideas explored more deeply in the 12 teachings of chapters 2 through 5. Jacob immersed himself in the wisdom of Jesus and of the Proverbs, and he's given us a great gift in this book of his own wisdom. This is a beautifully crafted punch in the gut for those who want to follow Jesus. And that is what the book of James, or Jacob, is all about.
So this is a great source of some context of one of my favorite books, but there's a lot of context and interpretation in here. So if you've read it, it helps you know the difference. So a couple comments. I think the positions are reasonable, but if you haven't read the text, you won't know. Here's a couple of ones. James never claims to be Jesus' brother. It's kind of the general understanding. Or anybody else except a servant of Jesus. And yet there's only 2 references to Jesus in the letter. Anywhere in the Bible does it describe James or anybody else who, as a brother of Jesus, as other than the brother. No half or step or whatever. The only thing we know about the family is that Jesus was the first child of Mary. Could be the half-brother. Could be all sorts of things. James never explicitly quotes Jesus of Proverbs, taking that from the using the language and so on, as he said. So it's not like it's interpretations are great, but particularly if you manage to read the text. And so James is one of my favorite, least read parts of the New Testament. It's a wonderful letter. So, if you decide you want to go with the guide of what the Old Testament thinks of the New. So Jesus quoted 24 different Old Testament books. And the New Testament as a whole quotes 34 Old Testament books. And the 5 books that are never quoted are Ezra, Nehemiah, Esther, Ecclesiastes, and the Song of Solomon. No books in the Apocrypha are quoted. And Jesus' top 4, the Psalms 11 times, Deuteronomy 10 times, Isaiah 8 times, Exodus 7 times. The internet's wonderful. You can go out there and you can ask these questions and you come back. So there's a list of all of them if you're really interested. It's not hard to find. So let's just go through the Old Testament quickly so you can decide what parts you want to read. Now Genesis. All of you Sunday schoolers the key stories are there. I've got creation, it's plural, of course. There's a couple of creation stories. Adam and Eve, Cain and Abel, Methuselah, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Esau, Joseph and his brothers. It's generally pretty good reading. Exodus and Numbers. This is most of the story of Moses and the wanderings in the wilderness. It's interesting, but it's a harder read. Leviticus and Deuteronomy. These are hard reads. There's a lot of ritual, about how big the tabernacle should be and how many ribbons there should be on the staff and so on. But there are a few lights in it, like the origin of the golden rules in these 2 books. Half in one, the other half's in it. Joshua. It's similar in difficulty and interest to Exodus and Numbers. This is the story of the first generation into Canaan. It's pretty bloodthirsty. But includes stories such as the fall of Jericho and the stopping of the sun, which, for all you scientific people, I know Roger is in that was really important in the whole Galileo controversy because, apparently if the earth went around the sun, God couldn't have stopped the sun. I'm not quite sure I followed the logic, but that's part of the heresy of Galileo. Judges. Judges is an interesting read that lends itself to reading a little at a time. It's one of the, there are a lot of little self-contained stories. Tells mystery history of the Israelite tribes, who were the kings, and includes characters such as Deborah, Gideon, Samson, and I'm the only one that ever knows about Micah, but anyway, he's truly weird. His mama rewarded him because he stole some things from her and then eventually he confessed. And then they made it into a prayer statue and then eventually got stolen by the Danites. Oh, it's a weird story. I always like it because it proves that the Old Testament is not Russian history. It didn't write out all the blemishes. A lot of them are still there. 1st and 2nd Samuel, which is an interesting history of the entwined relations of Samuel, Saul, and David. 1 and 2 Kings, that's from the death of David to the early Babylonian exile. It's got lots of moments of it, but it's patterned, so-and-so, but then he did bad in the eyes of God, and so on. But there's a lot of interesting stories, and it's certainly not particularly uplifting. There's not a lot of the lectionary that goes to that one. 1 and 2 Chronicles, which is a retelling of the history from the death of Saul to Cyrus, the Persian emperor that let the Hebrews go free after the Babylonian captivity. From a more priestly point of view, the first 9 chapters are endless genealogies. Endless. And if you're not doing the whole bit, I definitely picked the Samuel and Kings version over the Chronicles. Ruth, Ezra, Nehemiah, and Esther. Ruth. It's a short, interesting, uplifting story of bringing a foreign woman into Israel. She's David's great-grandmother. Ezra and Nehemiah. It's the history of the return from Babylon, the rebuilding of the temple in the early days of the Persian Empire, with lots of names and genealogies, and total rejection of foreign women. Always good to put those two concepts together. And then Esther is religious fiction of the exile with no mention of God in the canonical version. It said in the Apocrypha, they rewrite part of it with God in it. Job, an investigation into the question of why bad things happen to good people. It's perhaps a little drawn out. Raises a lot of good questions. Other than the mystery of God, it doesn't really have an answer, but that may be the answer. I always find it difficult to say that having a new wife and new kids is a replacement for old wife and old kids, but that's just my personal problem. Psalms, varied material. It's often uplifting and beautiful. It's religiously important. And it's easy to take in bite-sized pieces, because, there's 150 of them. Proverbs. It's lengthy wisdom literature, and it often reminds me of Polonius and Hamlet. Ecclesiastes, those of you at the funeral heard the usual reading from Ecclesiastes. All the time, things there is a season. It's shorter. I like it quite a bit. The Song of Solomon. It's poetry. Is it divine or is it erotic? You have to make your own call, because it's an interesting read. It's decent poetry. But Isaiah. He's one of the major prophets. And the major prophets aren't, even though they probably aren't major because they're more important. It's because they're long. The 5 major prophets are Isaiah, Jeremiah, Lamentations, Ezekiel, and Daniel. And Isaiah is written by at least 2. A lot of people think it's 3 different prophets, because one's writing in the time of the Assyrians, and the other one's writing in the time of the Babylonians, and that's 150 years apart. It is long, and if you can read one of them, this is it. And it's very religiously important. In addition to items probably foreshadowing Jesus, it also appears to be the first clearly monotheistic work. When you read the Bible, you'll see in the early days that they weren't necessarily monotheists yet. I always think of the Old Testament as a journey of people finding God. Jeremiah, which is a lengthy series of stories and prophecies before the fall of And after his exile to Egypt, nobody wanted Jeremiah around. He said, no, I don't care if you're in captivity. We'll let you go. Go to Egypt. Go away. It's interesting. It's generally bleak with a few gems of light. Lamentation, which is the shortest of the 5. It consists of 5 bleak poems bewailing the fate of Jerusalem. Ezekiel, which is a prophet basically of the exile. This is a difficult but fascinating vision. This is the dry bones and the chariot and all that. This book will appeal to some and drive others off. It really depends on your love of the fantastic. Daniel's actually two books kind of jammed together. The first 6 chapters are, religious fiction of the exile. It's got the story of the 3 friends in the furnace. And, your kids probably did a play at some point. The lion's den and so on. And the last 6 are apocalyptic. It's very influential in the New Testament. Jonah, which is classified in all the things as a short prophet, but he's not really a prophet. It's fiction with a point. It's a true delight and a must read. It contains the whale, really it's called Big Fish. But the problem is that story is so good people don't pay attention to the ending. It's a lovely ending. It's a great book. So, the minor prophets, they're short, but difficult texts. All have gems buried within, much that is obscure. And the general themes are social justice, religious unfaithfulness, and the patience of God. But if you read them, every now and then you come across somebody and say, oh, that's where that one's from. So, if I was just going to add 4 books in the New Testament, from the Old Testament and the New Testament, these are the 4 I choose. Genesis, Psalms, Isaiah, and John.
What's your plus?
That's my plus. If I was just doing that, I might then start adding things like Judges, because it's the kind of thing you can have by the side of your bed, read a couple of chapters, and then come back or what. Things like. So what do you do next? You've read the Bible or the New Testament plus or something else. I like to describe that as if you're a painter, you spread a ground on the canvas. It's a bit muddy and blotchy, but it's a lot easier to start painting the rest of the picture now. There are a lot of tools out there for individual study, but that's not what you need. What you really need is religious community. It's hard to get, it's nice to kind of read it and then make the connections and so on, or some of the connections. But you need, and I just try to put down 4 choices. You find and join a Bible study group. You create a Bible study group. Or you ask your church to put on programs with specific questions you have. You'll not be alone, so you can ask it. Harry or Andy or me or Ross or somebody or some combination. If you got some questions on it, we'll figure out a way to do it. And if you really feel like ambition to be ready, we can teach you this. Like I got started.